Welcome to today's webinar, Packed, Cracked, and Hijacked, Redistricting Reform in North Carolina. I'm Diana Wynn, President of the League of Women Voters of Wake County, as well as one of the co-chairs of our Redistricting Committee. Before we begin, I want to clarify a couple things about how we are using Zoom today. Except for the presenters, everyone is muted and you're not on video. We're not using the chat feature in Zoom today. Instead, type your questions in the Q&A feature. If you hover your computer mouse near the center bottom of your Zoom screen, a menu should appear. You should then be able to click on the Q&A option. Some questions may be answered in writing at some point during the presentations, and other questions will be answered live at the end of all the presentations. When you see a question, if you like that question, you're also interested in the answer of that question, you can upvote the question by simply clicking on a little thumbs up icon near a question that you're also interested in. Now let's get started. I first want to clarify two key terms. What is redistricting and what is gerrymandering? Redistricting refers to redrawing voting district boundaries based on population. We vote in many types of districts. Redistricting is an important and necessary process. So what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is related to redistricting, but gerrymandering is the intentional manipulation of voting maps to create an advantage or disadvantage for a political party or individual candidate. While redistricting is necessary, gerrymandering is unnecessary and it's harmful. Gerrymandering has been happening since the founding of our nation. In fact, the story of the word gerrymander goes back to 1812. Elbridge Gerry was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was governor of Massachusetts, and he was our 5th U.S. vice president. However, he's most notable for being the origin of the term gerrymander. Gerry was governor when Massachusetts redrew its voting maps in 1812. So it was Gerry that signed the redistricting legislation for those new maps at the time. Those voting maps were clearly manipulated for partisan advantage, and the press took them to task for it. One newspaper included this image that resembles a winged dragon to illustrate how manipulated the voting map appeared. And the Boston Gazette in 1812 published an article comparing that district to a salamander, and thus the word gerrymander was born. It's a combination of Elbridge Gerry's last name, though now we pronounce it Gerry, and the word salamander, gerrymander. Gerrymandering is harmful because maps are manipulated for the benefit of politicians. Elections don't necessarily reflect the will of the voters. When voting districts are drawn to almost guarantee that an individual candidate or political party will win, then there's less incentive for politicians to be responsive to us, their constituents. Unfair maps have also resulted in costly and time-consuming litigation. That is time and taxpayer money that could have been spent on other issues. Because the legislature loses many of those lawsuits, we've had frequent redrawing of our districts, which is confusing to the voter. Finally, gerrymandering can contribute to political polarization. North Carolina is one of the most gerrymandered states in the nation. According to a 2016 report of the Election Integrity Project, which compared democracies around the world, North Carolina ranked among the worst in the world for unfair voting districts. North Carolina needs to end gerrymandering and adopt a better process for creating fair voting maps. We have a large redistricting committee with several co-chairs focusing on different aspects of our projects. They've all been working on and advocating for redistricting reform for several years. And you're going to hear from each of us today. Mike Jennings, a former city planner for both Wake County and Chapel Hill, will introduce you to the basics of redistricting. Dr. Laurel Velker, our lead co-chair and a member of our board, will then explain how gerrymandering happens. Sheila Den, Vice President of the Wake League, will then talk about some of the options that we could explore for reforming the redistricting process. And finally, Cheryl Tung, our Advocacy Director, will talk about what you can do to promote redistricting reform in North Carolina. At the end of the presentations, we'll have time to answer some of your questions. Again, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. We're not using the chat feature today. And feel free to submit questions throughout all of the presentations. Before we move on, I do want to briefly clarify the League's nonpartisan stance. The League of Women Voters is strictly nonpartisan in its approach to any issue we take on a position, including redistricting reform. The reality is that both major parties have been guilty of gerrymandering. Mike Jennings will now talk to you about the basics of redistricting.
Thank you, Diana. And for those of you who saw that picture, that is of me. It's not my dog. I just haven't shaved for a while. But here I am. Okay. Not every election involves districts, but for those that do, I'm going to talk about why we vote in districts, why those districts need to be revised on a regular basis, the challenges we face to make sure everybody's vote counts the same, and the process used in redistricting. So first, why do we have voting districts? I think that districts allow voters to have their own representative in a larger body of elected officials. I believe that voting by districts brings government closer to the people. In North Carolina, we have districts for U.S. House of Representatives, North Carolina House and Senate, for judges, county commissioners, school boards, and for some municipal offices. As Diana noted, redistricting simply refers to the redrawing of district voting maps to make them roughly equal in population as population changes. Paula just told me to get rid of my cough drop. So why do we want equal population in voting districts? It ensures that everyone's vote is equal. This is also known as the one person, one vote principle. If our population was evenly distributed throughout the state, and if all the parts of the state grew at the same pace, redistricting would be simple. But that's not the case. The first challenge is that population density is not even throughout the state. This map shows the urban, suburban, and rural counties in North Carolina. The urban and suburban counties have a larger population density than rural counties. There are 80 rural counties in North Carolina, 14 suburban counties in gray, and 6 urban counties in blue. You can see that the counties with larger population density start from Wake County on the east, the blue on the east, and then go all the way down to Mecklenburg County. In addition, the counties around Asheville, Greenville, Fayetteville, and Wilmington also are either urban or suburban in nature. Okay. Second challenge to having equal districts is that the population change in North Carolina is unevenly distributed. This graph shows the population since 2000, when about 8 million people called North Carolina home. It's estimated that North Carolina's population will reach 10.5 million people by the end of this year. Going back to that earlier, if you'll just remember that earlier map, urban and suburban counties and the counties around them are expected to grow the most, while population in some rural counties is expected to stay the same or decline. So how do we make sure the districts are equal in population? After every decennial census, the General Assembly redraws the district maps. They do it in the year afterwards. So in 2010 census, they redistricted in 2011. Similarly, after the census is completed this year, just redistricting will be done by the General Assembly in 2021. As you can see, this year, 2020, is an important one. Our next cycle of redistricting starts in 13 months, at the end of July next year. And those new districts will be up with us for 10 years. Hopefully, the districts will be drawn in a fair manner. A word about reapportionment. The word is appropriate because after the census, the U.S. House of Representatives reapportions its 435 members among the states to accommodate population changes. North Carolina, as you can see on the bottom, has 13 representatives. And because its growth is projected to be greater than the average of all states, it's likely to gain another U.S. representative. And if that's the case, the General Assembly will need to draw congressional maps that accommodate 14 representatives as well as the population changes throughout the state. Unlike the House districts, the number of North Carolina legislative districts stays the same. The Constitution says that we have 120 representatives and 50 senators in our General Assembly. The General Assembly will need to redraw the districts for the greater population, but maintaining the 120 House and 50 Senate districts. That means that areas that grow faster than the average will have more General Assembly members, and the areas that grow slower or lose population will have fewer. One other point, and I'm focusing on the third and fourth bullets here. The state constitution prohibits mid-cycle redistricting. Now you're probably saying, wait a minute, we heard a lot about numerous redrawing of districts in the past 10 years. Those districts were declared invalid by either being racial or political gerrymandering, and the courts compelled the General Assembly to redraw them. So that's why they were able to be done during the cycle. Okay, while this webinar focuses on congressional and state legislative districts, it's important to note that some local governments entities also use and must redraw districts. In Wake County, the Wake County Board of Commissioners and School Board, the City of Raleigh, the Town of Cary, and the Town of Morrisville all use districts in some manner. The other 9 municipalities within Wake County elect their own officials at large. Each body is responsible for drawing its own map. We are watching this. We've got a subcommittee that has been communicating with those various local governments, and we will continue to monitor that. Now, the public input opportunities that we have vary among municipalities. Okay, on the 2021 redistricting timeline, hopefully you all have sent in your census information by computer next July, and that's when I talked about 13 months from now, is the deadline for states to receive data from the Census Bureau. December 2021 is the filing deadline for 2022 races, and that's the deadline for redistricting to be done. Now, we all know that we've got COVID-19, and that may change things. And the reason is that for those people who don't send in their information, somebody's got to go knock on their doors, and nobody wants to knock on any doors at this time. So, in summary, redistricting is necessary, and it's designed to ensure equal representation. Gerrymandering is the problem. Laurel Velker will now explain the process of gerrymandering, which is redistricting's evil twin. On to you, Laurel.
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike said, I'm going to invite you over to the dark side to talk about redistricting's evil twin, gerrymandering. And as Anna said, gerrymandering is simply the process of drawing our voting maps to create an advantage for someone, for a political party, for a group, for an individual. That sounds like a really simple definition. Like most of the things in politics, it gets complicated pretty fast. But before we go into the details, we're going to do an exercise to get us all into the gerrymandering frame of mind. And so I want you to pick an animal, and I want you to pick a cat or a dog. Those are your only two choices. Got to pick one of those. Now, I want you to take the animal, put it in your lap, stroke its fur, look into its eyes, and I want you to imagine that this animal represents all the things that are important to you, your most deeply held beliefs, the kind of society you want to live in, the kind of society you want to leave for your children, okay? Whatever your core issues are. You have your animal. All right, so let's get started. So we are going to imagine that we live in a state that is 60% dogs and 40% cats. And we get 5 House representatives in our state, and we're going to get to draw the voting maps from which we'll elect those representatives. Now, in a minute, I'm going to show you a few different ways that we might draw those maps. But right now, take one more look at that animal in your lap and remember what it represents. For each plan I show you, I want you to ask yourself a couple questions. So question 1, do I like this map? Do I win? And question 2, is this map fair? And that is not the same question. So here in this plan, we end up with 2 cats and 3 dogs in the house. I think this is pretty fair because it's proportional to the population. And so cat people, you might not love this, but you can probably agree that it's fair. Here in this next plan, we end up with 5 dogs and no cats in the house. So we've split our population of cats among those 5 different districts, and so they don't have a majority in any of the districts. And even though they are 40% of the population, their views don't really get represented. But dog people, how do you feel about this? You got all the votes. But is this fair? And now, dog people, how are you feeling? Now we've drawn a map where we've got 2 dogs and 3 cats in the house. And so even though our dogs make up 60% of our population, they're just getting 2 of our 5 representatives representing their views. So now, cat people, how do you feel about that? That's a pretty good map for you. Okay. Now, before we move on, I want you to take one more look at that animal in your lap. And again, remember what it represents. Okay? And if you were able to draw voting maps that ensured that your preferred animal would be in power, would you do it? Maybe I would. Okay, so let's move on. So what we showed you in that little exercise were examples of some common gerrymandering techniques. And one of those is cracking, where we take a group that would vote as a block and fragment it into several different districts so that they really don't have a chance to have a majority in very many of our districts. And our other main technique is packing. And packing is similar, but we think about this time we're going to concentrate all those voters into as few districts as possible. So that's what happened to those dogs when the cats were able to have a majority. So we put as many of these voters in one district as we can, and then they really don't have a majority or any chance of winning in the surrounding districts. And we can't really talk about gerrymandering without talking about all the partisan considerations that go into it. And partisan considerations can play into gerrymandering in a variety of ways that we might not expect. So for example, in true displays of bipartisanship, we've seen incumbents work across the aisle to draw safe seats for themselves. There are many ways that politicians can use politician addresses to favor or disfavor a specific candidate. So for example, we might draw a strong challenger out of an incumbent's district. And then, as we've seen many times, we can use election results down to the precinct level, and we know how each precinct voted, to create an advantage for a political party. Well, as you can imagine, with all this tinkering, what we end up with are maps that are not usually in neat grids like our dogs and cats. And this is the 12th congressional district in our state in 1992. And you can see it stretches in a thin line, basically from South Carolina to Virginia. And the Wall Street Journal called this district political pornography. And I think we can all agree it's pretty obscene. So all those waggly district lines lead us straight into the courtroom. And in North Carolina, that's where we've been for the majority of the past 40 years. This is a sampling, an incomplete list of all the redistricting related lawsuits in our state since 1990. And these include both Democratic and Republican gerrymanders. And as you can imagine, this litigation is extremely costly, both in terms of millions of taxpayer dollars and in time that our legislature could have spent working for us. And I want to leave you with an understanding of a couple of recent legal decisions that are going to affect us going into 2021. But before I do that, I want to distinguish between partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So gerrymandering based on race or drawn to disadvantage a certain racial group is unconstitutional, period. But the legality of partisan gerrymandering or gerrymandering based on political party or voting results, the legality of that one depends on the state constitution. Because last summer, the Supreme Court decided that partisan gerrymandering was non-justiciable. And I can't believe I made it through that word, non-justiciable. And so what that means is that the federal courts can't rule on it, and those cases are now kicked back to the individual state courts. And we were initially disappointed with that ruling, certainly. But what we've come to see is that it may have been a blessing in disguise. So our Constitution in the state of North Carolina was rewritten following the Civil War. And as such, we ended up with stronger voting protections than are in the US Constitution. And in 2019, last fall, we had a Superior Court rule that our state legislative districts were unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. And they ordered those maps to be redrawn using stricter nonpartisan criteria and using a transparent process. And then later on last fall, the US congressional districts were also redrawn in response to an injunction from that same Superior Court. So, where does this leave us going into 2021? So those decisions were great and they were good news, but we are not out of the woods yet. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding how this is going to work in 2021. So just to clarify, our current districts, we will not see any more litigation on those. We will vote under them in November, and then we'll draw some new districts. Okay. But some things that are feeding into our uncertainty for 2021. So the Superior Court that ruled that those maps were unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering, they accepted redrawn districts that relied very heavily on the addresses of incumbents and keeping incumbents in their districts. That is partisan data, okay? But the courts again still approved those maps. And maybe more importantly, the Superior Court's decision was not appealed, and so these cases did not go to the North Carolina Supreme Court. So we have not heard from our Supreme Court on partisan gerrymandering. So while we are uncertain, the one thing we know is that without redistricting reform, we will see partisan gerrymandering in 2021. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Sheila Den, who will hopefully lead us back into the light and talk to us about some of the principles of redistricting reform.
Thank you, Laurel. So we've talked a little bit about how redistricting can go bad, but how can we make it go better? How can we reform redistricting? The first issue is who does the redistricting. There are three main models for who draws the maps: the legislature all by itself, an independent commission, or a politician commission. By far, the most common model is for the legislature to be responsible for drawing the districts. That's the case in North Carolina and in 35 other states. You can see on this map all the states where the legislature draws the districts in red. The details can differ. So in many states, a 2/3 majority is required to pass district maps, and in most states, the governor can veto the districts. Some states leave the redistricting completely up to legislators, and others employ advisory commissions of experts to help legislators with the process. So what is the process in North Carolina? In North Carolina, legislators have complete control of the redistricting process. There do not need to be 2/3 majorities in either chamber to pass redistricting maps. The governor has no veto power over redistricting legislation. And as if that weren't enough, state law includes very few limitations on how legislators can go about drawing the maps. So that's what we have now. How could the process be better? Well, one model for improving the redistricting process is to form an independent commission. States that use independent commissions are shown in yellow on this map. An independent commission would consist of a group of citizens, none of whom are legislators, who come together to draw the district lines. The details vary in the different states, but in most cases, no public officials, either elected or appointed, are allowed to serve, and commissioners, logically, are not allowed to run in the districts that they draw. However, legislators are still often involved in nominating the citizens to serve on the commissions. So even if they are not choosing commissioners directly, it's not like they're completely cut out of the process. The Politician Commission lies somewhere in between. So legislators do not have all control over redistricting, and it's not as completely independent as an independent commission. This hybrid approach is only used in a few states, which you can see here in the dark gray. In a politician commission, elected and other public officials are allowed to serve, but they are joined by other citizens who have been nominated, usually by the state's political parties. Each state that uses this model has its own spin on it, so it is difficult to generalize. But the idea is that legislators are not solely responsible for redistricting, making this arguably a better model than what we have now. So we've talked a bit about the who of redistricting form, but what about the how? No matter who is in charge of drawing the lines, it is very important that they use impartial criteria. Some of this is determined by either federal or state law. For example, under the law, districts must be of equal size as far as possible in order to satisfy the doctrine of one person, one vote that Mike talked about earlier. Districts must be as compact as possible. There are many measures of this, but basically a district is compact if its residents live as near to one another as possible. Under this standard, I think we can agree that the district that Laurel showed really is not particularly compact. Districts must be contiguous. A district is said to be contiguous if you can travel from any point in the district to any other point in the district without crossing the district's boundary. So you cannot have a district that is a square here and then another square over here with a district in the middle. Finally, districts must comply with the Voting Rights Act. Basically, this means that minorities must have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. Now, there are other criteria that are not required by law, represented here by the squares rather than the check marks, that we at the League believe really should be followed. These include keeping cities and counties whole. Note that there is an inherent tension between one person, one vote, and the ability to keep cities and counties whole. Sometimes there is no way around dividing some counties or cities in order to maintain equal population in districts. Keeping communities of interest together. Now, communities of interest is a bit of a fuzzy term, but the gist of it is that you do not want to split up neighborhoods, say, that are culturally distinct in some way unless you have to. An example of not keeping a community of interest together is when the area around NC-A&T University was redistricted so that norms fell into 2 different legislative districts. Ignoring partisan data. There's a whole list of partisan data that can be and has been used to gerrymander districts. This includes data about the addresses of incumbents, previous voting results for different precincts, voters' party affiliations, and voters' voting records. We believe that none of these should be used as part of the redistricting process. So now that we've talked about the who and the how of redistricting reform, Cheryl is going to talk a bit about what we can do to help bring redistricting reform about.
Thank you, Sheila. So let's now discuss how redistricting reform happens. Currently, 26 state constitutions allow for some type of citizen initiatives or referendums to appear on the state ballots. These types of citizen-led mechanisms allow citizens to vote whether or not to approve redistricting reforms, approve maps, or vote to create independent redistricting commissions. However, no such citizen-led reform option exists in North Carolina state constitutions. As you can see in this graphic, all reform for North Carolinians resides with our state legislature and originate from 3 different paths. Litigation has been the primary way for improvements in redistricting. However, this is not ideal as it's very time-consuming. Improved maps can take years to go through appeals process, and even then, new maps may not be ideal. The next path, passing impartial redistricting rules. Here we can work to convince legislators to adopt impartial redistricting rules. This can be successful when a window of opportunity exists, meaning if the current majority party fears losing its majority status during the next redistricting rounds, then they may want to protect themselves against gerrymandering from the other party by passing legislation on their way out. The last path, through a constitutional amendment, we can work to convince the legislature to initiate a constitutional amendment adopting an impartial process. Again, this may be advantageous during that window of opportunity. I would note here that there are some advantages and disadvantages to an amendment. Amendments are extremely difficult to undo. And so unlike legislation, it cannot easily be undone by subsequent legislation from another party. In addition, if the amendment is too restrictive or too weak, it can also yield unintended consequences or not have the teeth to provide meaningful reform. It is important to note that any one of these solutions is likely to involve legislators. No matter the path, any successful reform must include a transparent process to avoid gerrymandering. Most gerrymandering has happened in secret and often by partisan consultants. There has been little opportunity for the public to understand or provide input on what's happening until it's done and the maps have been approved. Transparency provides that lens from which the public can view and participate in the process in an effort to gain trust. Also, it is important to understand it doesn't matter whether you have an independent commission or a group of legislators with consultants. Without a transparent process, gerrymandering can occur no matter who draws the maps and regardless of the criteria they are supposed to use, or in the case of partisan incumbency, should not use. Transparency is truly the key to fair maps and the only way to hold legislators accountable for a fair process. We have another webinar on July 27th covering transparency and redistricting in much more depth. In this webinar, we'll discuss the best practices of transparency and examine what transparency components should be implemented in each phase of redistricting, as well as budgeting and timelines for transparency. We would love for all of you to attend this webinar, and you can register for the webinar through the LIG website under the tab Events. What can you do? Well, as a voter, 2020 is an important year. The legislators we elect this November are the ones that will be drawing the maps. In addition, this is the year I described earlier as the window of opportunity. What can you do to ensure officials believe in fair redistricting and will work to ensure a transparent process? Well, there are several things. One, ask candidates about their position on redistricting. This can be asked during candidate forums, during any political meet and greets. These now will most likely be virtual, but you'll still have the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. Then, let me get my little mask. You can vote. Vote based on their positions. Redistricting is a foundational political issue. It's very hard to make progress on other issues without ending gerrymandering. It is core as to whether legislation does or does not get passed and whether all voices are being represented. Request an absentee ballot to avoid long lines and COVID-19 exposure. Request forms can be found on both the state and county Board of Election websites. You can print one for yourself and encourage others to do so as well. I know you have probably already completed the census, but encourage others to complete it as well. Explain to others that the census is the building block to redistricting. It provides us with accurate numbers, so long as everyone participates. Contact your state representative and senator and request they support impartial, nonpartisan criteria and a more transparent process. Urge them to start planning for 2021 redistricting now, especially given the delay in the receipt of census data. Next month's transparency webinar will discuss what they should be doing now. In fact, states with commissions started preparing last year. Help get the word out by telling others about the issue. Use social media. Write letters to the editor about why impartial redistricting and transparency are important. I'll talk more about how to do this effectively in the next slide. Attend legislative hearings when they are discussing redistricting. Again, this is not possible at the moment, but you can listen into the committee meetings and provide comments to legislators. On our website at LWV-Wake.org, we have lots of resources to help you understand the issue and to share with others. These can be found under the Issues tab and then the Redistricting tab. Our resources include fact sheets. We have many of these and they provide an excellent overview of the basics of redistricting. We also have reports on different aspects of redistricting, including a detailed review of redistricting litigation from the past decade and best practices for transparency in redistricting. There is also an in-depth messaging guide. This, along with other documents under the action tips, can help develop written materials like letters to the editor, social media, and presentations more effectively. In addition, we offer a book discussion toolkit for David Daley's book titled Rat-Effed: The True Story Behind the Secret Plan to Steal America's Democracy. This book does an excellent job of explaining how gerrymandering was so successful, beginning with the 2010 Project Red Map. We can also facilitate the book discussion for your group. Last, you can also invite us to speak to your group about redistricting. We can do this via Zoom, or when in-person events are safe, we can come to your events. So just to briefly summarize, gerrymandering is complicated, but the principles of fair redistricting are simple. We need to both understand and demand meaningful redistricting reform to end the gerrymandering that has allowed politicians to handpick their voters. There are many ways to make your demands known, as well as to educate and motivate others before our next redistricting cycle. And last, it is important to remember that as with life and most efforts to any reform, this is a marathon and not a sprint. This is the end of our slide presentation, but we've set aside time to answer some of the questions that were posted in the Q&A box. Sheila, could you read some of them?
Yes. So first of all, this one I think is for Mike. What is the intention of North Carolina constitutional limits on state representatives and senators? As the state population grows, this limit inherently means that one person represents more people, which would seem to lead to poor representation. Why not represent one representative per X number of people?
Well, I wish I had a good answer to that, because that's the first time I've ever even thought about it. I think that every governmental unit has a limit on the number of people. The House of Representatives 435, and we're 170 for our General Assembly. So it's a good question. I have no idea what the answer is, other than that's just common practice.
Diana?
Yeah, I believe it's really a practical approach. It's how large do you want your governing body, your Congress or your legislature to be? So as the population grows, if we added more people, it could become increasingly unwieldy. Maybe you could argue it already is, but adding more would just be, I think it's a logistical issue for the most part.
What are the timelines and status of bills in front of the House and Senate at this time? Laurel, did you want to take that one?
So we know that there were a few redistricting bills that crossed over from last legislative session, variety of different approaches to reform. And there was a bill introduced a couple months ago that started thinking about really doing some prep and getting ready for 2021. We have not seen anything have a hearing. We have not really seen much chatter around it. We in some ways don't expect a lot of activity till after the election and on these things. So that's kind of where they are. They're basically in a holding pattern.
And I'm not really sure who this is for. Would a voters' rights amendment to the Constitution ever be a consideration? Something like every citizen has the right to cast a vote and the government shall not impede, suppress, or negate that right in any way. Why or why not?
I guess I could make a comment that we do have the one of the things that have been upheld in the courts with the one person, one vote, as well as equal protection during the Westbury versus Sanders, where the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the one person, one vote. That might be what is similar. And they do use that for, in North Carolina and most states, for requirements for redistricting. You know, whether they have, that's a pretty broad, and we have seen the one person, one vote be used in Supreme Court decisions. So far, because they don't rule on partisan, it's fallen back to the state courts. And so I think the state courts for us would analyze something like the one person, one vote. But, you know, getting an amendment to the Constitution will always require, at least for North Carolina, our state legislature to vote on something like that.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I think that's an intriguing concept to, you know, put an amendment about voters' rights into the state constitution. But I guess I would remind everyone that theoretically, we have both U.S. constitutional protections and we have legislation in all sorts of other acts at the federal level. Yet, we still have voter suppression activity and efforts to limit voting. So I think that all it would do is give us, us meaning any group that works on behalf of voter rights, a hook for litigation. And I don't know if it would be any more than what we have at the federal level. I'm not that much more familiar with it.
Cheryl, lots of people want to know where you got your mask.
My mask, there it is. Actually, I saw it on a friend's Facebook post, and it was that person's friends who made them. They're made in Atlanta by a group, and I do have it actually. Handmade with Love in Atlanta. It's got a little company names, GCXD, and I don't know if it's a website, but I'll look into it and I'll post it on the League's Facebook if I find it.
And there was a question about the People First Act, and I was trying to get clarification if that is referring to the For the People Act in Congress. And the question was, were some of these ideas that the other questioner talked about in the Voters' Rights Amendment? Yeah, it's the For the People Act of 2019, which is HR 1 up at the federal level. Whether some of these voting rights amendment ideas were in this bill, in the For the People Act. And I do believe, not directly. So from what I'm seeing, it really is looking more at voter access, election integrity, election security, political spending, and ethics for the three branches of government. Now, it does expand voter registration and put limits on removing voters from voter rolls. So, so that aspect of suppressing the vote is addressed by HR 1. Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't even know this about the For the People Act. It does actually provide for states to establish independent, nonpartisan redistricting commissions, which sadly is why I believe it will never pass, but it's a wonderful idea. I know that the League at the national level had a big push to try to lobby for HR 1 earlier this session, and they were, successful in the House, but have not had success in the Senate. Let's see. How successful have states that use the independent commission been in forming fair districts? Laurel, do you want to tackle that one?
I would say it varies. One thing we have seen is if there are lawsuits, states that have drawn districts using a commission tend to win lawsuits a lot more than legislatures do. And Cheryl, I might throw that to you as well. Do you have any comment on that?
I do think that overall, I have read that the maps have been more fair with independent commissions, but to your point, there still is litigation, but they do tend to win. So I do think that overall, the maps have become over time less contested.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that, it's important to remember that just because you do a map via an independent commission, and maybe it's perfectly fair, if you think back to Laurel's cat and dog exercise, that even if it appears fair, that may not be, it may not mean that somebody is happy with the outcome. And so litigation can be filed by anyone for any reason, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will win those cases. And as you've already heard, what it appears is that when litigation is filed, they're less likely to when it appears to be done in an independent way. And I'm not going to speak in detail about it, but I think that the consensus is in general that independent commissions produce more fair maps. That does not mean, depending on how you get to an independent commission, that a system can't be gamed, right? Any system could potentially be gamed, in terms of how do you choose the people on the independent commission, for example. What is the composition of the independent commission? And do we know the criteria they're using on an independent commission? So an independent commission may be independent in that they're not politicians on it, but the criteria that's used is also important. So I think it takes us back to what Cheryl was talking about, that we have to have transparency in any form in which map drawing is done, whether it continues to be done by legislators or if it's done by an independent commission or something in between, like some form of politician commission. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I just
No, I
want to
think
say that that segues nicely into our upcoming transparency webinar, because the success of the independent commission, like any of these models, really depends on the public being able to see what it is that they're doing.
Right. And, and I would just add that there was a question earlier about, what is the status of some of these bills? And Laurel gave a good summary that, they haven't really gotten a hearing. And some of the bill, they're what, 6 now, including the more recent one, I believe. So there are a total of 6 bills that have been filed and they're sitting out there, but none of them have really gotten any sort of a hearing. And the league does not have a particular position on any one of those bills. Not at this point. I don't know if we're going to take a position, and that's going to be determined at the state level by the state league. What I will say is that all 5 of us, have carefully reviewed the legislation, particularly the first 5 bills that came up. The 6th one is, it's much more technical about the process, so I'm not going to speak to that. But the first 5, one of them calls for a constitutional amendment. The other 4 call for, I believe, some form of a commission that reforms in the process. And I will tell you that all of them have some strengths, but all of them have some weaknesses. And I would caution any of the attendees on the call to support a particular bill without really taking a look at it and listening to what people who are advocating for redistricting reform are saying in terms of its strengths and its weaknesses. Because again, while we want legislation, we really do, we want a system that is changed and results in a fairer system. We've witnessed it with our own eyes, and we see it in the proposed legislation, that a system there are loopholes and it can be gamed, and you have to be very careful to try to foresee the ways in which a politician might be able to take advantage of a loophole or game that system. So watch those bills if they ever get a hearing, and really listen, not about whether it calls for redistricting reform, because that's what we want, but we don't want a bad bill either. And we certainly don't want something to end up in our Constitution that might be bad legislation. We'd love to have something end up in our Constitution that is good legislation. But as I believe Sheila, or maybe it was Laurel, talked about, there are pros and cons to a constitutional amendment, so we have to be very, very careful about any bill that claims to do redistricting reform, and then we need to look at to what extent it really addresses the problems.
There's a question: is anyone hosting the film Slay the Dragon to publicize the need? I know that Jennifer Bremer at LWV-NC was trying to find a venue to host that film, but obviously in pandemic times, it's a little tough to, you can't really get a venue per se, and then trying to stream a film, there are issues, copyright issues and things of that nature. So I'm not really sure that that's going to be easy to do until after we're able to be out and about in the world again.
And I would say if people are looking for, you know, a story about redistricting, RAT-EFT is a great book, and we have some discussion kits out there for it. So if you're in a quarantine book club, that's a great one to add.
Okay, I am not seeing any more questions, so I'm gonna talk kind of slow in case somebody's typing real fast. No,
Well, Sheila,
I-
we're about out of time, so this might be a good time to end. So why don't we wrap it up here? I want to thank all of the attendees for coming. We had a great turnout to this webinar. And if you go on our website, lwvwake.org, we have another redistricting webinar. And it is going to talk about transparency in the process. So all of us were at the legislature during the last few rounds of redistricting, some of which were under court order for a more transparent process. And quite frankly, even under that court order, we saw gerrymandering happening right in front of our eyes, just a few feet away from us. And it was very instructive. So Cheryl and Laurel have been working, I think, for over a year now on researching best practices, and they're going to be doing a webinar to follow up on the one we did today on what those practices should be and what we should be demanding from our legislature as they move forward and design a redistricting process, whether it's the same way it's done by the legislators, or whether it's we get some sort of improved legislation with a commission. Either way, we're going to need to advocate for more transparency in redistricting. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll sign up for the second webinar later on in July.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.